The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'Do not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' you will be liable to the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on your way to court with him. Or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that anyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out, throw it away. For it is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off, throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. It was also said, 'Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce.' But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not swear falsely. Carry out the vows you have made to the Lord.' But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. Do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
At various points in our lives, we've all wondered, how in the world did it get to this? How could this have possibly happened? Today, we see Jesus addressing issues that often cause these surprised exclamations: murder, adultery, divorce, and swearing, which swearing in the ancient context meant taking oaths. It did not mean using a curse word. These are heavy topics, and they're hard topics. And they were heavy and hard in Jesus' time as well. This is not a feel-good passage. It's not an easy one to explore, but it is really important. I've heard many stories over the years of people interpreting these passages very literally and very rigidly. and it tears them up inside. They read this chapter and believe that it is sinful to simply be angry, or that attraction to another person is wrong. They stay in abusive marriages because Jesus says that adultery is the only acceptable reason for divorce, and that doesn't happen to be their issue. They refuse to swear on anything at all. They refuse to give their word for anything. It would be impossible for me to address each of these issues in depth with you in our time this morning. But there's a central theme that underlies all of them that is applicable to many areas of our life today, even if we never engage in the specific issues that Jesus is addressing. And that underlying theme might best be quipped as nip it in the bud early before things get out of hand. Today's gospel lesson follows immediately on the heels of last week's lesson. Last week we heard Jesus said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill." What we find in our passage today is Jesus teaching on what he means by fulfilling the law. He doesn't do away with the law. Far from it, he actually amplifies it. We hear Jesus say multiple times, "You have heard it said," with a quotation from the law, "but I say to you," and then he expounds on this law. The statements can be hard for us to hear sometimes since they're based in a time and culture that is different from ours. But I think that what lies behind the statements is still incredibly relevant. If we look carefully, each section is about interpersonal relationships. They're about how we interact in our lives with each other and with God. The Jewish laws that Jesus is referencing here deal with very concrete actions: murder, adultery, divorce, and swearing falsely. Jesus says that these are indeed bad. He doesn't question that, but he asks us to take it one step further and look into what leads up to these actions. What he's doing here is intentionally engaging his audience in a conversational style of teaching. So he doesn't just lay down the law and says, "This is what it says, period, the end, no discussion." Instead, he asks them to think about what it means, about what would cause these things to get to the point where this particular law would be broken. Jesus affirms the Jewish law, but he's constantly challenging his followers to ask what the spirit is behind the law. And that's what we see going on here today. The particular violations of the law that Jesus addresses in our passage today generally don't happen out of the blue. There's a build-up to it. Jesus encourages us to recognize when those build-ups begin and then address the issue at that point, rather than allowing it to play out and turn into something harmful for ourselves and others. So let's look at these each briefly. Jesus says, "You've heard it said, 'Do not murder,' but I say to you, don't be angry with a brother or sister." The murder that's being talked about here is assumed to be premeditated. This is not a statement about self-defense. It's not a statement about military action. Jesus is assuming that something has incited this murder, that there were thoughts and actions and wrongs that were done that led up to the point of physical sin. He is, in essence, saying, when you feel anger in your heart, address it then. Don't let it grow and fester and turn into something much greater. And this doesn't just go for your own anger. It's also applicable to others. So Jesus instructs us that if we know that a brother or sister is angry with us, that we should approach that person and try to be reconciled to them. If we know that someone is accusing us of something, then we need to address it with the accuser before things escalate and others have to become involved. Again, Jesus is trying to say that we should address the problem at its source before it gets to the point of sin. His prohibition against adultery is similar in nature. Jesus says, "You've heard it said, don't commit adultery, but I say to you, don't lust." Like murder, adultery doesn't happen out of the blue. There's a build-up to it. So Jesus is saying that we need to address the problem at the source. We need to address our own attitude, our own insecurities, and our own dissatisfaction with the way that things currently are. While we often think of adultery in sexual terms, it can also be a metaphor for other things in our life. We can lust after anything: objects, money, power. And when we read the prophets, God frequently uses the metaphor of adultery to describe the Israelites worshiping other gods rather than staying true to theirs. Regardless of whether adultery is literal or figurative, lust is an attitude of the mind, and it is something that can be addressed before it gets out of hand. Jesus' statements on divorce are related to his statements on adultery, but they require some contextual explanation. In Jesus' time, divorce of a Jewish couple could only be initiated by the man. It's predicated on the idea that the woman was the property of her husband, and therefore he had the right to discard her when he chose. She, on the other hand, was completely bereft of the power to end a marriage, regardless of what the circumstances were. A certificate of divorce stated that the husband was choosing to divorce his wife, and that she was then free to marry again. There were two schools of thought operative at this time. One of them said that the husband could divorce the wife for any reason at all. Literally any reason. He could divorce her if she wasn't a good cook. He could divorce her if he thought that she talked too much, or she had some weird personality quirk that got on his nerve. Anything at all could be grounds for divorce. The other school said that a man could only divorce his wife for unchastity. And it's the second school that Jesus aligns himself with. At a time when a woman's entire livelihood was wrapped up with her husband, divorce was very dangerous for women. Divorce, she could literally be cast out on the streets with nothing and no one to help her. Divorce carried significant social shame, and so the likelihood of her returning to the home of her parents or to another relative's home was dependent entirely on that relative's sense of generosity, and it was not a guarantee. The children remained property of the father until they were grown, so divorce could be especially devastating for mothers with young children. Given all of this, Jesus' prohibition against a husband divorcing his wife except for unchastity can actually be seen as a way of him attempting to protect the interest of women. It's far from perfect, but Jesus is preventing men from simply casting off their wives when they get annoyed with them or tired of them. He is insisting that the husband continue providing for the wife. The last section on swearing also requires a bit of contextual explanation. At its heart, it's really about integrity. Jesus says, "You've heard it said that you shall not swear falsely, but I say to you, don't swear at all." Swearing was a part of everyday life in Jesus' time. It's how oaths were taken. It's how decisions were made, both legally and interpersonally. To swear to something meant to give your word, and your word was intricately bound up with your own integrity, but also with the honor of your entire family. The prohibition against swearing falsely, therefore, that we find in the law is self-explanatory. Don't bind yourself to promises that you can't deliver on, or to knowledge that you know to be false. But for Jesus to prohibit swearing at all takes things to a whole new level. Jesus is saying that oaths should be unnecessary. We should simply let our word stand on its own. As he says, let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. And in following the previous pattern that we saw with murder and adultery, In saying this, he's attempting to cut off the problem at the source. You can't break the law by swearing falsely if you're not swearing at all. Today, we deal with the same problems that Jesus addresses in our passage, even if they operate differently. And hopefully, we're still being taught the same lesson. Our emotions guide our behaviors, and so many sinful behaviors can be avoided if we're willing to openly feel and address those emotions early on. If we acknowledge our anger, our lust, our dissatisfaction in our marriage, or our desire to lie, if we can acknowledge these and address them head on, perhaps we can prevent them from leading us down paths that we know are morally or spiritually dangerous. None of us is perfect. None of us is without sin. We are all ongoing works in progress in our relationships and in our faith. Following Jesus' instructions, may we have the courage to examine our consciences, to address the issues that we find there, and to nip them in the bud before they get out of hand.